Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're looking at the impact of the pandemic on contentious politics. Hello, my name is Alan Renwick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. We've been away for a few weeks over the Christmas break, and what a remarkable time it has been. In the United States, the sitting president and his supporters have sought to overturn the result of a democratic election, leading ultimately to an assault upon the Capitol building. The democratic process has meanwhile continued, however, with the elections in Georgia giving Democrats the narrowest of majorities in the Senate. On this side of the Atlantic, the UK and the EU finally agreed a trade deal of sorts on Christmas Eve. Around the world, there has been growing optimism on Covid-19, with the great vaccine rollout beginning, but the pandemic itself has reached new heights. New, more contagious variants have emerged in the UK and South Africa and seem destined to spread widely in the weeks and months to come. This second series of UCL Uncovering Politics will be touching on many of these and other themes. Next week, Inauguration Week in Washington, D.C., we'll be catching up with developments in the United States. Thereafter, we'll be exploring the ethics of punishment, the politics of climate change, and much else besides. But this week, we're going to focus on the political impact of COVID-19, and particularly the pandemic's effects on so-called contentious politics, politics conducted through confrontational means, whether protests or strike actions or indeed insurrections. What is the role of contentious politics in the political process as a whole? And how has the pandemic changed contentious politics? Has the heightening of inequalities increased people's willingness to protest, or have social distancing measures stifled popular voice? Indeed, have those in power used the pandemic as a pretext for suppressing free speech and other civil liberties? Well, joining me to explore these questions are three of UCL's leading experts on contentious politics, all members of the Conflict and Change Research Group here within UCL's Department of Political Science. Kristin Bakke is Professor of Political Science and International Relations and conducts research on conflict dynamics, post-war societies, and how states respond to opposition within their borders. Nils Metternich is Associate Professor in International Relations, working on quantitative analysis of protests and civil wars. And Katerina Tertytchnaya is Lecturer in Comparative Politics, focusing on public opinion and protests under authoritarianism. Kristin, Nils, and Katerina, welcome all to UCL Uncovering Politics. And before we get to the impact of COVID-19, we should just understand what we mean by contentious politics in the first place. So, Katerina, what is contentious politics?
I should say that, for our audiences as well, contentious collective action is really the action at the very heart of social movements, rebellions, riots, strikes, and revolutions, right? It does not have to be violent. So contentious collective action does not have to be violent for it to be contentious. Contention arises precisely from the fact that there is an imbalance of power between the conflicting sides, if you like. And you have demonstrators, people, ordinary citizens who take to the streets to express their disagreement and their opposition to an all-powerful opponent. That opponent is sometimes the state. Right. So ordinary citizens lack access to institutional resources. They don't have access, for example, or good access to political parties or to pressure groups. And this is what makes contentious politics contentious. It's not because people are, more extremist or more violent, or because they seek confrontation. There is an imbalance of power that makes collective action contentious.
Great. Thank you, Katerina. And that gets us towards the issue of what we should think of contentious politics. So we're recording this on Monday, the 11th of January, 2021. And last week saw one of the most extraordinary episodes of contentious politics that any of us will remember, I suspect, the storming of of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And that's an action that's clearly been universally condemned, or pretty much universally condemned by reasonable people. So contentious politics currently kind of looks quite bad. But as Katerina is suggesting there, it's pretty obvious, I think, that contentious politics can also sometimes be a good thing. So, Kristin, can you help us get a handle on what's the appropriate place of contentious politics?
Yes, thank you, Alan. So, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom to disagree. I mean, this is what democracy is about. And we perhaps tend to think, or like to think, that in democracies, the key avenue for people to express political preferences is through the electoral process. Sometimes that's not enough. Not all voices are heard, or people feel that not all voices are heard and will take to the streets in response. Now, if this happens occasionally and the political system responds and sort of corrects the exclusion of, say, marginalized groups, or it sort of puts an issue that has been ignored on the agenda, that's not necessarily a sort of quote unquote bad thing. It is problematic, though, if certain groups in society consistently perceive that they are excluded and persistently think that institutional channels, regular politics for voicing their demands are not going to work for their voices to be heard. And I think the problem on that point is twofold. One, it's a problem if certain groups are consistently excluded through regular democratic processes. And the second, it's a problem if certain groups, based on misinformation, think that the regular democratic system is flawed, even if it isn't. Now, to echo what Katerina said earlier, in autocracies, protest may be the only way out, or the sociologist Jeff Goodwin talks about no other way out, right? This might be the only way out, or the only way for people to express their dissatisfaction with the regime, and hopefully sort of create or foster change towards regime change. Now, the reason to get really worried about the contentious politics is, of course, when it gets violence, when it turns deadly, when it turns into long-lasting conflicts, when it turns into conflicts with massive civilian suffering, or any civilian suffering, without resolution, and where it turns into societies and states where reconciliation will take years. That's when, of course, we get really, really worried about contentious politics. But, per se, it's not necessarily a bad thing that people take to the street to change something that's going on in society, or put an issue on the agenda.
Nils, would you agree with that?
I would even go a step further. I would say it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's actually a very fundamental aspect of democratic political life. And if we look at some of the very important sort of historical events, like the civil rights movements, these are important contentious politics events, and they brought about positive change. And we sort of think that they were important for democratic systems. So if we think about contentious politics, it's always important to think of it as system dependent. That is, when do we actually need this contentious politics, for example, in a democratic process to move forward? And I would think that there are two particular functions here. And one is that if you have a minority that wants to advance its agenda, contentious politics is a very good avenue to do so and to raise awareness to these issues. And then, of course, the second aspect is if there are fundamental democratic rights that are denied, for example, by the government. So let's say the votes are not counted correctly, right? Then there is certainly a space for contentious politics. And so if you look at the storming of the Capitol, if there were actually sort of an instance where 3 or 4 states don't count their votes correctly, and if you would actually have an illegitimate democratic leader advancing, then of course there would be a role for contentious politics. But this is in this instance, this was not the case, right? There was sort of not the case that the democratic votes were counted incorrectly.
So does that suggest that contentious politics is a symptom of failure of kind of uncontentious politics? I mean, if contentious politics arises, Kristin said, because of misinformation, or it's necessary because votes have perhaps not been properly counted, or minorities have not been properly heard, does that suggest that if the democratic process is working properly, you don't actually need contentious politics. Nils?
Well, I think this is what the question of what is proper, right? And we're still talking about human-made institutions. And there are certain goals that these institutions have. That is, for example, fair access to the political process, and free speech, and sort of other values that we hold important. However, because these are human-made institutions, and there are also people who are sitting in the institutions who have particular interests, the access to power might not always be as we wish it to be. And therefore, contentious politics is a way to, at times, correct for that and bring about, improving institutions. So I would say it's a very natural part of a democratic system to have contentious politics, and has a very important space in ensuring that the values that we hold dear in democratic states, that these are being upheld.
Katerina, would you add to that?
Yes, I agree with what Nils has mentioned here. I think it's important to think of contentious politics as aiming not just to change policy, which sometimes is the ultimate goal, but also to bring about broader social change, right? So individuals or groups, social movements engaging in contentious politics do not just target elites, right? The political elites, the government, the institutions. They also try to build broad alliances, societal alliances. They try to gain the support of public opinion. They try to bring new questions, marginalized questions on the agenda. So it is a long-term process that is often most times beneficial to the democratic process as such. As I said, this imbalance of power between the conflicting parties, if you like, is absolutely essential in our definition and how we understand collective politics.
Great. And before we move on to COVID-19, Kristin, you're nodding very firmly in response to both Nils and Katerina there. Do you want to add anything further?
No, I know. I mean, I agree with them. Like freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, this freedom to take to the streets if need be, then that's part of what democracy is about.
Great, thank you. So let's then think about what has happened to the incidence of protests and other forms of contentious politics around the world since the pandemic has begun. Nils, what can we say about that? In what ways has the pandemic shaped conflict and contentious politics over the past year or so?
Yes, so COVID, of course, not only had an impact on our personal lives, on our social life, but also on the political life. And what we've seen at the very beginning of the pandemic is, of course, that because of these restrictions that were put in, because of the perception of high risk of mass gatherings, we've seen initially a stark decline of political protest on the street, of contentious politics in the street, especially in those states that were affected, especially in sort of Western European states. We might be able to talk about some differences in terms of non-Western European states. And then what we have seen is sort of a increase again in protest, which has sort of come back to maybe not normal level, but you see sort of protest happening. However, what has changed to the pre-pandemic protest is that the composition of the protest is very different. So if we sort of think back, right, the big protests that were happening and covered by the media before the pandemic were, for example, Friday for Future demonstrations, climate change demonstrations. And now, of course, we've seen sort of Black Lives Matter protests, then anti-lockdown protests. So other forms of protests that before were either not covered as well or didn't have any relevance, for example, anti-lockdown protests. So I think the composition has changed, but we nonetheless, again, see people who are unhappy with the status quo who are turning out. So,
and you think that shift from the Fridays for Future, the climate protests, to things like Black Lives Matter can be attributed to the effect of COVID-19?
Well, I think that those people who are turning out now, who are willing to take the risk or ignore the risk of sort of being out in the street and maybe getting infected, are those that are extremely unhappy with the current status quo, right? They have immediate grievances that they feel they need to voice now. And of course, I think that's a little bit of the difference between, let's say, the political issue of climate change, where people might think, okay, we can also sort of fight for that in 3-6 months' time rather than now. But there are other parts of society that really feel that their status right now is so unbearable that they need to take to the street. And I think that's why you see sort of a shift in the composition.
Katerina, you've also been looking at the evidence from around the world on this question. What do you see?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for political scientists, this has been a year of many surprises, right? We went into 2020, following a very, 2019 was the year of protest. We saw protests happening all around the world, mainly to condemn government abuses, to protest against malpractices and social inequalities. So going into 2020, it was a very big question whether this trend would continue or not. And we were indeed taken by surprise when we saw a very sharp drop in the amount of protests taking place around the world in the early spring as a result of the pandemic, and of course as a result of government responses to the virus. And I don't think it's it is easy or possible or even desirable to isolate the effect that the virus has had from that government responses to the virus had on contentious politics, broadly speaking, but also demonstrations specifically. So we've seen a drop in protest in early spring, and subsequently, I think this was particularly the case in the US. We have seen an increase in actions that sought to condemn, what was perceived as violations and infringements on personal rights. For example, in Michigan, we had right-wing groups occupying the Capitol to, demonstrate against lockdown measures that were imposed. And I think many of us will remember President Trump tweeting, against, for the liberation of states that suddenly saw lockdown measures being imposed. So I think, again, the virus and government responses changed the reasons why people would take to the streets. They created new grievances, if you like, but it also changed the opportunities, the way people calculated the costs and benefits of participation. And I think to what Nils said, of course, there was this sorting mechanism, if you like, where these additional obstacles imposed by the pandemic made people think twice. And it was those people who were really committed to a certain cause, or those people who found the current status quo more unacceptable than others, who took the step to leave their homes and protest. But I think another interesting dimension that we should acknowledge is that, to a large extent, the pandemic also caused a transformation or a shift, if you like, in movement organization, right? With many street protests now moving online and internet activism blooming in the last few months.
I think people might be quite interested in the evidence that you're drawing on there. So you talk about, we can kind of track patterns, overall patterns and levels of protest around the world. What is the evidence that you're actually drawing on in order to say that?
Yes, of course. So protest event analysis is a big discipline within comparative politics, and we have ACLED, the Armed Conflict and Contentious Events data set. It's an effort to collect protest events as they unfold in live matter, that has been compiling protest reports on a daily basis, and it has been an invaluable resource for everyone studying protest. We also have other efforts to study protest as they happen in autocracies, in democracies in the United States. So this has been truly invaluable for political scientists to study these events.
Fascinating. Thank you. So we can see there these patterns and levels of protest and who's engaging in more or less protest. And we've started to talk a little bit about what affects these changes. So I guess what we're hearing from you there suggests that for some people it's become more likely that they protest, for others perhaps less likely. Kristin, coming back to you, what do we know about how COVID-19 has impacted the opportunity structures, if you like, for those thinking about engaging in contentious politics?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there are different ways to think about this. So to echo some of what Nils and Katerina says, the pandemic itself has and is likely to continue to strengthen existing grievances that may foster or fuel conflicts such as poverty, inequality, state weakness, dissatisfaction with governance more generally, and the economic downturn that might follow is not necessarily going to make things better. And then there are the political sort of consequences, what governments have done in response to the pandemic. So government responses to the pandemic have restricted civil liberties and for some created grievances due to those restrictions. Now, to the degree that those restrictions outlive the pandemic, we may see further democratic backsliding, and that in itself may be likely to foster and fuel conflict. If you want, I can talk a little bit about some of what we have seen in terms of these restrictions that governments have imposed in response to the pandemic.
Go for it.
So we saw early on that governments took what we think of as very unprecedented steps to limit our freedom of assembly to fight the pandemic. And several of these steps, social distancing, encouragement to stay at home, limits to the number of people who can gather, have been necessary to fight the pandemic. And lots of people agree that these are necessary steps to fight the pandemic. But other steps may not be necessary, such as limits to freedom of expression. Now, under human rights conventions, governments can adopt measures that limit civil liberties, such as right to peaceful assembly, in order to protect public health. But those exceptions are, of course, not to be used by governments to do whatever they want. And we have seen over the course of the pandemic, governments impose restrictions that do raise concerns. So a few examples. In March, the Hungarian parliament granted Prime Minister Orban the right to rule by decree as long as he wanted. Though the state of emergencies was later replaced with a state of medical crisis for them to return to a state of emergency later on in November again. We also, in China, in the early stages of the pandemic, we saw the Chinese authorities silence doctors who were raising the alarm. Iran, we saw that the police was arresting people for, quote unquote, online rumor mongering about the spread of the pandemic. So we've seen measures that sort of raise concerns about are these sort of necessary measures. And why would governments do this? One rationale is that governments think they cannot handle the crisis and they fear accountability costs, so they're going to try to silence their critics to reduce those costs. Alternatively, the crisis might be giving governments as a cover to crack down on critical voices that they had wanted to silence, not just because of the pandemic, but for a longer time period. Now, in terms of, what do we know? So these are, I just mentioned some examples here. And there are data collection efforts by different organizations to try to track, what has happened in terms of, restrictive measures. So the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, they report that at present, 130 countries have imposed measures that affect freedom of assembly. 96 countries have imposed emergency declarations. 50 have imposed measures that limit freedom of expression, including limits to media freedom. And 53 have imposed measures that affect privacy, so surveillance measures. Now, not all of these measures are reasons to worry. The ones to worry about are the ones that endanger democratic standards, and particularly the ones that endanger democratic standards, not now, but are likely to remain in place after the pandemic. So, blanket bans on freedom of assembly are, of course, reasons to worry, or limits to freedom of assembly and expression that seem to target certain groups and not sort of give a reason for why are those groups rather than others targeted. Or, weakening of democratic checks and balances, or measures that don't have time limits, so state of emergencies without time limits to them. The varieties of democracy projects based at the University of Gothenburg, or it's a big international initiative aimed at collecting data on democracies over time across all countries in the world. They, at the early stages of the pandemic, they launched an initiative to try to, keep track on what is happening over the course of this year in 144 countries. And they've collected data on restrictive measures in 3 waves, so they can actually look at what's happened over time. And, the motivation there is to see, are we sort of seeing democratic backsliding, right? Because that would be what the worry is. And, there are some good news in the data that they've collected. So 34% of countries, of the 144 countries that they have data for, have committed no or only minor violations of democratic standards in the response to COVID-19. And for democracies, this share is higher, 55%. 44 countries showed fewer violations at the end of 2020 than early on in the pandemic, right? So, that's good news in the sense that these restrictions might have eased over time. Then there are some less good news in these data. So only in 14 countries, and 13 of them are democracies, did they include no violations at all. In 35 countries, the varieties of democracy, good people there, they document minor violations, such as a few isolated instances of limited access to information. But in 95 countries, so 66% of all the 144 countries, they note sort of worrying developments, that these are measures that are restricting democracy in worrying ways, not in minor ways. And they, as I said, they note that there has been improvement from early on in the pandemic until the present, but there is this sort of worry that these measures might be sticky and stay in place also after the pandemic ends.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much, Kristin. So that's looking at evidence kind of at the country level, if you like. Nils, what you were saying earlier, I think, was suggesting that there's actually quite a lot of variation in how the pandemic and government responses to the pandemic have affected individual groups and different protest movements and that kind of thing. Can you maybe pick up on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the first real important thing, of course, for these protest movements, the different protest movements that we have seen, is that they are suddenly contesting in a very sort of uncontested public space, right? So usually, in London, every year we see hundreds and thousands of demonstrations. And now, as soon as you get together 100 people, you will be covered by the media in some way with a high probability. So there's this opportunity for new movements to come into the space. And the other thing, and that goes back to the composition that was mentioned, is that those movements that are actually able to demonstrate, to perform this collective action, they of course send sort of a costly signal. That is, despite basically they're sending the signal that I'm suffering from the status quo so much that I'm willing to take the risk of exposing my health to a potential COVID-19 infection. So, for example, today, if you looked at the news, there were these Italian students who are now protesting against sort of home learning or remote learning because they want to go back into the classroom. Well, we only sort of see that, and it's being covered internationally, is because we're sort of thinking, oh, these young people find this issue so important that they're willing to go into the street despite the risk to themselves. And so this sort of opportunity that the pandemic gives individuals to perform this sort of act of contentious politics is I think, very, very important. And it allows for actors to have a voice that would usually, basically not be heard.
Fascinating stuff. We're almost out of time, but one final question to Katerina. I was quite struck when Kristin was talking there about the really worrying evidence that we have here on effects upon democratic process, free speech, and so on. And yet we're not hearing anyone talking about that really in the public sphere. There's very little discussion of how this pandemic process has affected our democracies. So, Katerina, do people not care about this? Is there not public concern about restrictions on protest, or are people actually kind of happy with the changes that have taken place over the past year?
I think it's often very tricky when we speak about the people in general, but I would say that there is of course great concern about the impact of the pandemic on democracy and freedoms, and this is well documented in public opinion surveys that we have from around the world. What is also alarmingly documented in surveys that take place in different countries is that the pandemic has also coincided with a temporary, what was seen, a temporary shift in authoritarian values. So people being more supportive of restrictions on rights and freedoms to defend, public health, etc. So I think it is for sure an alarming trend, maybe one that's not so much reflected in public discourse as much, but one that has certainly been the subject of intense academic debate over the past few months. The public is, I think, on average concerned about the impact on rights and freedoms, but I think concerns with the pandemic also influence the public in another way, and this has to do with the way they come to evaluate those who take to the streets in order to express grievances in the current context. And I think we have seen many people to support the causes of demonstrators, but actually to disagree with their tactics. And that is why it is so important for protest organizers and participants, I think, to show that they're protesting, and trying to respect public space and to maintain social distancing to the extent possible, because this is another way that they can gain the support of public opinion.
Nils wants a final word before we wrap up.
Maybe not a final word here, but I think it is very interesting that citizens are willing to give up on particular freedoms if they see a personal risk themselves, right? If you look at, the terrorist attacks in 2001 and sort of what sort of followed from that is that people were willing to give up a lot of freedoms because they felt they had a risk to themselves by terrorist attacks. And I think that in the current situation, I think we have a very similar situation that individuals, they're just dealing on a day-to-day basis with the risk of COVID. They're concerned about their business, their family, their friends. And so I think that's why it's they're sort of accepting at this point potential restrictions. And I think as soon as the pandemic sort of wanes away, that debate will come back roaring.
Kristin, do you want the final word?
In terms of what Nils just said, so we do know that people are willing to give up some of their freedoms to protect themselves, right? And just to give an example, so we've seen since August, we've seen this massive protest, unprecedented protest in Belarus about the election there. And these protests, are about the election and the fact that the sitting president claimed that he won 80% of the vote, and the opposition says that, that's not the case. And, there's been widespread sort of dissatisfaction with the president for a long time. This is not something new, but what surveys of young people show, and these are surveys done by the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin, and they've surveyed sort of 18 to 34-year-olds over time. And the last surveys that have, after the protest started, show that part of, the things that people were concerned about was that Belarus did not implement sort of sufficient restrictions. So Lukashenko sort of quite infamously was sort of mocking the virus and saying that this was a conspiracy and that, encouraged people not to wear masks. And surveys of young people show that, well, actually, they were not very happy about that. Right. So people are willing to, give up their freedoms and are concerned when governments don't seem to take are seen as not taking sufficient steps.
But you share Nils's optimism that once the immediate pandemic is over, people will kind of return to wanting to getting these freedoms back again.
Yes, I mean, I don't know. I don't have the data for that. I would think so. Yes, I would think so.
Always reminding us that we need the data in order to be confident in our findings. This has been such an interesting conversation. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Kristin Bakke, to Nils Metternich, and to Katerina Tertytchnaya. It's been so interesting to hear there's such a wealth of great research going on over the past year into these important issues. So thank you for being our expert guides through all of that. As I mentioned at the start, next week is Inauguration Week for President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. So our US politics panel, whom you heard from in November, will be reconvening to see what sense can we make of the last 2 months and what can we expect from the 4 years to come. That promises to be an unmissable discussion. And remember to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Renwick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.